first thought. That is a sugar for tonight. As for the general weather, tomorrow and early this afternoon, sunny periods and patchy cloud. A warmer day with easterly wind, very warm over the northern and western Isles and eastern. And that is all for us here at the Sunday Group tonight. My name is Vijay. Thank you so much for your company. This film.
Welcome to the inquiry on the BBC World Service. Crashes in the South China Sea are becoming more frequent.
There are many islets and submerged features in the region, and the countries are trying to construct bases, airfields, military features over these geographical features. So sovereignty is a critical issue here.
Water cannons, lasers, even knives are being used by Chinese sailors to deter rival claimants to the waters.
If any one country were to have absolute control of the South China Sea, the Philippines would essentially be at its mercy.
Who has what at stake?
The U.S. sees no value in wading in with messy historical arguments that frankly are probably irreconcilable anyway, and which involve multiple U.S. partners and allies.
This week we're asking, what can a rusting warship tell us about tensions in the South China Sea? I'm Tanya Beckett. Join me on the inquiry after the news.
Hello, I'm Royal Alderson with the BBC News. At least 12 people have been killed and many others injured in a rocket attack that hit the Druze town of Majdal Shams in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Most of the casualties were teenagers who were playing football. The Israeli Prime Minister blamed Lebanon's Hezbollah movement. It denied involvement. IDF spokesman Daniel Hagari also said Hezbollah was responsible.
Our forensic team has made it clear this rocket was the rocket called Falak 1. It is manufactured in Iran. It is delivered to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the only terror organization in Lebanon that holds Falak 1. There are no other terror organizations in Lebanon that can fire Falak 1.
Donald Trump has told a Bitcoin conference in Nashville that he would champion cryptocurrency if he wins the US presidential election in November. Here's David Willis in Washington.
Donald Trump hasn't always been a fan of cryptocurrency. During his time in the White House, he dismissed it as highly volatile and based on thin air. His conversion has come at a time when major crypto companies, executives and investors have been making big donations to his presidential election campaign, vowing to ease regulatory oversight of the industry. Mr. Trump said Bitcoin was going to the moon, as he put it. Mr. Trump said that since he changed his stance on cryptocurrency 2 months ago, his campaign had received $25 million in donations, much of it in Bitcoin.
His likely Democratic Party opponent in the election, Kamala Harris, has told a fundraising event in Massachusetts some of Mr. Trump's criticism of her was weird. Tuareg rebels in northern Mali say they've inflicted heavy losses on government forces and allied Russian mercenaries. They said dozens have been killed, wounded or captured during 2 days of clashes close to the Algerian border. The group is fighting for an autonomous homeland in northern Mali. The Venezuelan president Nicolas Maduro has defended the decision not to allow several former Latin American leaders into the country to observe Venezuela's presidential election on Sunday. Panama said Venezuela only reopened its airspace after the former leaders got off the plane, Leonardo Rocha reports.
Mr. Maduro described their attempt to fly into Caracas as ridiculous and said they were far-right politicians who knew they were unacceptable in Venezuela. Among those on board were the ex-presidents of Mexico and Panama, Vicente Fox and Mireya Moscoso. They said they were supporting the opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, who's leading the opinion polls. A group of Spanish members of parliament critical of Venezuela's socialist government have also been sent back to Madrid. President Maduro, who is seeking a third term, is sending a strong message to his critics, making it clear that he won't be intimidated by claims of irregularities in Venezuela's electoral process.
BBC News. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi have forcefully reiterated their respective diplomatic positions during a meeting on the sidelines of an ASEAN summit in Laos. Mr. Blinken expressed concern over Beijing's provocative actions around Taiwan and its support for Russia's war on Ukraine. The Chinese foreign minister told Mr. Blinken that Taiwan was not and will not be a country. Reports from Sudan say the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces have launched renewed attacks on the besieged city of Al Fasher. Local witnesses say there was heavy artillery bombardment on Saturday. On the first full day of sport at the Paris Olympics, the French hosts have been celebrating their first gold medal win when their rugby sevens team won the final. Led by their star player Antoine Dupont, France beat Fiji 28 points to 7. The BBC's commentary team were watching.
Time is up. Antoine Dupont. Sometimes it's written. And it is for this French team. History made. The first gold medal of Paris 2024 for the home team. France Rugby Sevens winners.
The French team who didn't qualify in Tokyo are now glorified in Paris. With 70,000 here and millions around the world watching.
Australia heads the medals table after dominating the swimming events. They have 3 golds in total and 2 silver. And the World Football Federation FIFA has deducted 6 points from the Canadian team at the Olympic Women's Football Tournament, following the flying of a drone to spy on New Zealand's training session on Monday. The manager of the Canada team, Bev Priestman, has been suspended. That's the latest. BBC News.
Welcome to The Inquiry. I'm Tanya Beckett. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. On June the 17th, a Chinese boat deliberately rammed a Filipino vessel in the disputed South China Sea. A video released by the Philippine military appears to show Chinese coast guards having boarded the Filipino vessel, wielding knives, spears, and swords. A Filipino sailor is alleged to have lost his thumb in the violence. China denied its personnel were to blame, saying they had been restrained. The clash was the latest in a string of confrontations in recent years, with accusations that Chinese ships have also used water cannons and lasers to harass Filipino sailors, delivering supplies to the military ship, the Sierra Madre. The ship itself was deliberately grounded by the Philippine military in 1999 and is by now very dilapidated, though it does still house a small crew. The Sierra Madre has become symbolic of a broader battle over who precisely owns what in terms of the tiny islands, rocks and reefs scattered across the South China Sea. They are remote, barely inhabited and in some cases submerged underwater. And yet they have become a focus for international concern. This week on The Inquiry, we're asking, what can a rusting warship tell us about tensions in the South China Sea? Part 1. Muddy Waters. The South China Sea is a vast body of water connecting the expanses of the Pacific and Indian Oceans and providing a shipping pathway across Asia. It extends south and westward from the coast of China and the island of Taiwan, past the Philippines and Vietnam, before continuing on to Malaysia. All of the countries that border the South China Sea depend heavily on its waters for their trade, not just within the Asia region, but also as a maritime passage to nations further west. Our first expert witness is Dr. Hashim Turker, an independent researcher based in Istanbul.
historically, all the countries, not only the coastal countries to the South China Sea, but also the other countries, for example, Japan and India's economies are also closely tied to the South China Sea.
No country's fortunes are more intertwined with the South China Sea than the nation on the eastern and northernmost reaches of its waters, the People's Republic of China.
As the second largest economy in the world, with over 60% of its trade in value traveling by the sea, this makes the region much more significant for global security and global economy.
Vessels travelling through the region either make their way through the northeast towards Japan or south and west towards Malaysia, India, and then Europe.
There are two major straits. One of them is the Strait of Malacca and the other is the Luzon Strait. The Strait of Malacca is in the southern bound of the South China Sea, and it is one of the world's most crucial maritime choke points.
The Malacca Strait is a body of water between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and Malaysia. It's home to more than 40 ports, and passage through it accounts for a third of world trade. At its narrowest, it spans just 65 kilometers and is also prone to congestion and collisions.
Around roughly $3.5 trillion in trade transits through the South China Sea annually will be affected by any closure of Strait of Malacca. And for example, the Arctic region can sometimes be seen as another option, but it is only available in summer times nowadays.
In other words, for ships there really isn't a reliable alternative. Both Asia and the West depend on the South China Sea and its access points for the flow of goods. But for the countries that border it, which include the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Taiwan, and Malaysia, it's also an important hunting ground for fishing vessels and offers a wealth of minerals.
It is rich in resources, and it is estimated to contain about 11 billion barrels of oil and 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And the fisheries are very significant to the coastal countries because many of the countries are developing countries in the region and their economies are closely tied to the South China Sea.
Scattered across vast expanse of the South China Sea, opportunity to stake a national claim.
They are hotspots of geopolitical tension, and there are many islets and submerged features in the region, and the countries are trying to construct bases, airfields, military features over these geographical features. So it makes this issue more complicated because sovereignty is a critical issue here.
The history of these territorial claims goes back many, many years, but we begin our story in the first half of last century. At that time, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, was part of the Japanese Empire, and Tokyo laid claim to most of the South China Sea. This was upended with the Second World War and the defeat of Japan.
In 1951, it renounced its claims in the region, but this renunciation did not include reversion of territory to previous owners, so it has made all these issues more complicated. For example, the People's Republic of China, it sees itself as the legal successor of the Republic of China since the end of the 1970s. It claims all the land features in the South China Sea.
Taiwan borders the South China Sea. Beijing's ambition to bring Taiwan under Chinese rule would therefore give China leverage to dominate a larger expanse of the region's waters. But China's claims extend much further than that. Time for our second expert witness. Part 2. China.
South China Sea means a lot to China. It is a vital shipping lane for China's e-commerce and industry. It is vital for China's strategic submarine-based access is also rich in terms of maritime resources that the Chinese would like to tap into.
In 1947, the Republic of China issued a map showing the South China Sea. It detailed claims going back centuries to when the Paracel Islands to the north and Spratly Islands to the south were regarded by China as integral parts of the Chinese nation. Professor Steve Sang is director of the SOAS China Institute in London.
The Chinese claim really is a mix of economic, political, and strategic considerations. The official claim is based on, in quotation marks, history, but then history, as far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned, is something which must serve China's national interest, meaning whatever the party says history is, history will follow.
2 years after the map was drawn up, the People's Republic of China entered 3 decades of leadership under Mao Zedong. The domestic turmoil that followed left little room for worrying about the sovereignty of the rocks and reefs of the South China Sea. But when in 1976 Chairman Mao died and Deng Xiaoping took power, China entered an era of explosive economic development. And that had very important implications regarding its ambitions for trade.
In the 1970s, they started to pull the map out from the drawer and started to claim that China has jurisdiction over the South China Sea. And once that started, the historical claim was being reconstructed, and basically, as far as the Chinese are concerned, it goes back to time immemorial. The South China Sea is always Chinese.
But if China wanted to lay claim to most of the South China Sea, it was going to need to enforce that claim. After the Second World War, the waters had been effectively watched over by American forces. Now China set about developing its own substantial naval fleet.
Effectively, from the end of the Second World War in 1945, South China Sea was policed and secured by the United States Navy, and the Chinese went along with that because they really had no alternative capabilities to match that. Now, I think the Chinese feel that, thank you very much, Uncle Sam, you have done your job. We are now ready, and we should be protecting South China Sea, not you. Now that China has a fleet of nuclear strategic submarines, it has also now acquired a serious strategic value for China's nuclear deterrence. Because if China controls the South China Sea fully, then they will be able to make sure that when Chinese strategic submarines sail out of the base, they would not be so effectively monitored by the US and other Western countries.
Over the last 40 years, China has built up the largest maritime fighting force in the world. But the country's claims over the South China Sea overlap with those of other nations in the region. Indeed, in 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that they had no basis in international law. China rejects the ruling and insists that its claims are legitimate. And of course, they are intertwined with Beijing's insistence that Taiwan is rightfully part of the Chinese mainland.
By China claiming jurisdiction over Taiwan and Taiwan exercising jurisdictions over Taiping Islands, it strengthens China's claim of the South China Sea as a whole. And here, because of the political need for Taiwan to maintain that it is still officially the Republic of China, it cannot give up its claim over the disputed islands in South China Sea either.
But all this has now gone much further than maps, court rulings and claims of sovereignty. It's reached the point of dangerous confrontation. Time for our third expert witness. Part 3. Sierra Madre. The Philippines claims several islands in the South China Sea, some of which are part of the larger Spratly Islands group, in areas which they refer to as the West Philippine Sea. International maritime law also allows for the waters off the coast for up to 200 nautical miles to be claimed as part of a country's territory. In 2022, there was a change of government in the Philippines. The former leader, Rodrigo Duterte, had attempted to keep the country's relationship with China on an even keel, despite the disagreements over sovereignty in the South China Sea. But when Ferdinand Marcos came to power, he took a different approach.
The tension has always been there. The Duterte administration cooperated with China in keeping things quiet. They did not make a big thing out of China's movements. They even cooperated in downplaying them. And that, I think, is what led China to become so used to operating so deep within the West Philippine Sea and so used to Philippine units not presenting any problem, any resistance to their efforts to exercise control over the South China Sea.
J. Baton Bacao is a professor at the University of the Philippines and director of the Institute for Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea.
The Philippines is linked to the rest of East Asia through maritime trade that crosses the South China Sea. Its air transport also crosses the South China Sea, so if any one country were to have absolute control of the South China Sea, the Philippines would essentially be at its mercy. The South China Sea is very important to the Philippines for various reasons. First of all, for purposes of food security, the South China Sea is the source of up to 27% of its total marine capture fisheries. It's also important for energy security because the most prospective areas for offshore petroleum are in the South China Sea side.
All the submarine cables that link the Philippines to the rest of the world essentially pass through the South China Sea. So it's also vital for the country in terms of access to the internet. This helps explain why the Philippines have over the years been at pains to stand up to acts of intimidation by the Chinese, especially as diplomatic efforts seem to get them nowhere.
Unfortunately, in the 2000s and especially in the 2010s, it became clear that China had begun to assert more and more forcefully its claims to the South China Sea. So from that time, China became more insistent in asserting its unilateral claim to the South China Sea. And that resulted eventually in a confrontation between the Philippines and China in 2012. And this forced the Philippines to initiate international arbitration against China.
The confrontation in 2012 was the loss of the Scarborough Shoal to Chinese control, a reef claimed by the Philippines but now held by China. But there has been a much longer running story which began over 2 decades ago and has more recently become an escalating battle. And it's over the presence of a rusting ship called the Sierra Madre. Way back in 1999, the Philippines beached the vessel on top of a submerged reef in the Spratly Islands, 100 kilometers off its coast. It's called the Second Thomas Shoal. The move was a way of staking out Manila's maritime claims in the South China Sea, and a response to China building a naval base on a reef just a few kilometers away.
Second Thomas Shoal and the BRP Sierra Madre stand as very visible challenges to China's claim to the South China Sea and to Chinese power in this region. Second Thomas Shoal was determined by the arbitration award to be a low tide elevation and therefore part of the Philippines under international law, and China had no rights to appropriate this or to claim sovereignty over this. So this reef and that ship on it stands as proof of the invalidity of China's excessive claim.
A quarter of a century has since passed. The ship is extremely dilapidated and before too long will become uninhabitable. In the meantime, it is dependent on Manila sending supply boats to maintain it and feed its small crew. But more and more often these missions have been threatened by Chinese ships, and increased media attention has done nothing to stop the attacks from happening.
So the increased attention to China's more aggressive actions basically led to China becoming even more and more aggressive, from issuing warnings to engaging in dangerous maneuvers that would almost result in collisions. China began to use lasers and even began colliding with the Philippine vessels.
If supplies were to be stopped from getting through, this could have serious consequences, not least for the ship's crew.
That would essentially make the outpost unviable. The people there would starve and would be unable to maintain their posts. If they do that and they're forced to leave for purposes of survival, then China will come in, probably destroy the Sierra Madre, and station Coast Guard or militia vessels around the reef to prevent any other Philippine vessels from coming near that place again.
Time for our fourth expert witness. Paul, policing the waters.
The idea that the oceans are a global commons, even before that term was popularized, has been with the U.S. since its earliest days. So while the U.S. tends to whipsaw on a lot of issues, this has been one thread that's always run through the idea that it is illegitimate for states to claim vast areas of the sea as if they were land, that the sea is something to be shared by everybody, and that U.S. national security and national prosperity depends on the maintenance of those open sea lanes.
Maritime confrontations between the Chinese and Filipinos create an awkward dilemma for the United States, because the Philippines and America have a mutual defense agreement. This means that an escalation of clashes in the South China Sea places China and the US in an uncomfortable position. Gregory Poling is from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He says that America is viewing tensions in the South China Sea with a very cautious eye.
The U.S. sees no value in wading into messy historical arguments that frankly are probably irreconcilable anyway, and which involve multiple U.S. partners and allies. But the U.S. is very concerned about the credibility of its alliances, which particularly means the defense of the Philippines at this point. The U.S. has a moral and legal obligation to defend the Philippines. So the U.S. has always said that while it's neutral on territorial claims, it would be illegitimate for those claims to be pursued through the use of force, i.e. for China to use force against its smaller neighbors.
How crucial does the United States see the resolution, the agreeable resolution of this dispute as to its economic future and its political and strategic future?
I don't think that the U.S. government or most close watchers of the South China Sea think that it matters all that much for the economics of the United States or most other countries. What matters to the U.S. and really all of the international parties who have spoken up on this, more than 24 now, who have supported the Philippines publicly against China, is the impact on international law and norms. The idea that this is a canary in the coal mine. If China is allowed to shred an almost universally accepted set of international laws just because it has bigger boats and guns these days, then where would it stop?
There's been a lot of concern over the possibility that Beijing would launch an assault on Taiwan to impose rule on the island which it sees as part of the mainland. It's worth reminding ourselves that Taiwan also has claims in the South China Sea. But as a final thought, our fourth expert witness says the risks of conflict in the waters of the South China Sea pose a much more immediate threat than China's designs on Taiwan.
It seems that the risk of military escalation is quite high and getting higher, far higher than the risk of escalation around Taiwan, but it's not likely to escalate to the level of general war. What the South China Sea could do is provoke short, contained China-Philippines or China-US military clashes that could put us into a real cold war that could lead to the hardening of divisions between Beijing and Washington that both sides have been trying to manage to this point.
Now we return to our question. What can a rusting warship tell us about tensions in the South China Sea? China makes claims to vast swathes of the South China Sea which overlap with those of other nations in Southeast Asia. The claims date back to the middle of last century, but in more recent years, Beijing has started to aggressively enforce them. China now possesses the largest navy in the world and has even built 3 naval bases in the South China Sea from which it can patrol the waters. It can also use them as platforms to harass other ships. And there have been a series of dangerous standoffs. Other nations in the region are not inclined to stand up to China, so the real danger is that the United States becomes drawn further into the struggle to keep the waters open for international trade. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Tanya Beckett, produced by Jill Collins and researched by Katie Morgan. The editor with Tara McDermott and the technical producer, Richard Hanford. This is the BBC World Service, and in the forum, what has motivated people throughout history to climb mountains?
That human experience of challenge, adversity, mastery, skill set, understanding consequences, and managing the risk.
Who were the first climbers?
This modern idea that to truly enjoy a mountain, you should be climbing it for its own sake, it dismisses as irrelevant all the ways that people in the past existed on mountains.
And why are we so obsessed with who reached the top first?
Even 2 people reaching the top together, you want to know who literally put their foot on the summit first. It doesn't really matter because they couldn't have done it without the other.
Exploration, science, religion, politics, and nationalism all played their part in people wanting to stand on the highest points on Earth. The Forum, History of Mountaineering, at bbcworldservice.com/forum, or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
This is the BBC World Service. I'm Suzanne Wilton, and in the $6 billion gold scam, I've been investigating the man at the heart of the world's largest ever gold fraud, Michael de Guzman. This time, just how did a young Filipino geologist get mixed up in the wild ride of Bre-X, a small Canadian mining company, and their once-in-a-century discovery in the Indonesian jungle? Join me after the news.
BBC News with Moira Alderson. A rocket attack on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights has killed at least 12 people. Most of the dead were teenagers playing football in the Druze Arab area of Majd al-Shams. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has blamed Hezbollah and vowed revenge. The Lebanese-based group has denied carrying out the attack. Donald Trump has told a Bitcoin conference in the United States that he would champion cryptocurrency if elected in November. Mr. Trump once dismissed digital currencies as a scam, but has since sought backing of potential donors. His likely Democratic Party opponent in the election, Kamala Harris, has described herself as the underdog. Tuareg rebels in northern Mali say they've inflicted heavy losses on government forces and Russian mercenaries. They said dozens had been killed during 2 days of clashes. The army said only 2 of its soldiers had died. Reports from Sudan say the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces have launched renewed attacks on the besieged city of Al-Fasher. President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela has defended the decision not to allow several former Latin American leaders into the country to observe Sunday's presidential election. He described them as far-right politicians who were unacceptable to Venezuela. In a face-to-face meeting with his Chinese counterpart, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has expressed concern over what he called Beijing's provocative actions towards Taiwan. The Chinese foreign minister countered that Taiwan was not and will not be a country. The biggest wildfire to hit California this year is continuing to spread rapidly. The park fire, which began near the city of Chico, has almost doubled in size since Friday. At the Olympic Games in Paris, Australia are leading the medals table. After the first full day of competition, they've so far dominated the swimming events. That's the latest world news from the BBC.
First, a warning. The following episode contains references to suicide and death. From the BBC World Service and CBC, this is the $6 billion gold scam. A man named Michael de Guzman is standing in front of a hotel mirror. He's getting ready for a night out in a mining town in East Kalimantan, Indonesia. De Guzman is a short, heavy-set Filipino man. It's the evening 18th, 1997. He heads to a karaoke bar, has a few drinks, sings his heart out to Frank Sinatra. The next morning, Rudy Vega, de Guzman's colleague, knocks on his hotel door. De Guzman opens the door. He's disheveled, half awake. He's here to take him to the airport. They make it to the helicopter pad. Rudy Vega rushes to get him ready, and de Guzman climbs into the chopper. He's by himself back there, and the pilot helps him with his seatbelt. De Guzman doesn't recognize the pilot. He's not the usual guy. The front passenger door snaps shut. Check. The rear door is pushed forward and closed firmly. Lock. Check. Then they take off, headed for Busan, the site of the largest gold discovery in the world. The chopper flies across a blanket of green jungle. It tips toward a peat swamp. Crocodiles slither into the water. The surface ripples from the downdraft. Below lie 9-foot king cobras and other venomous snakes. Wild pigs forage for nuts and roam through the vines. It's all familiar to de Guzman. He's taken this flight many times. It's now 10:30 a.m. Central Indonesia time, 20 minutes since takeoff. The weather and visibility is good. The helicopter is flying at an altitude of 800 feet. A routine flight until suddenly something's wrong. There's a pop, a loud bang, and a whoosh of air. The pilot maintains control, dips the helicopter to reduce speed, and he looks back to see what's happening. He sees an empty seat. The left-hand door is fully open. De Guzman is gone. The pilot radios the tower, shouting, "My passenger has jumped from the helicopter." Michael de Guzman plunges 800 feet into swampy Borneo rainforest, presumed dead. 10 years later, I was sent halfway around the world by the Calgary Herald to investigate de Guzman's death. This story has haunted me ever since. How was he tied up with the wild ride of Bre-X, a small Canadian mining company, and their once-in-a-century gold discovered? It's still a mystery. I'm Suzanne Wilton, and this is a story about the lengths people will go to in pursuit of getting rich. This episode is The Fall.
Mabuhay, Philippine Airlines welcomes you to Jakarta.
I've just landed in Jakarta, Indonesia. This is where it all began.
Coming through and ready, doors may be open.
I'm here to trace the events that led up to that moment in the helicopter. It's hot, humid, and loud, the opposite of my Canadian hometown, Calgary, Alberta. All these years later, I still have questions about what happened, and I'm here to get answers. Starting with what happened to the chief geologist, Michael de Guzman.
Nobody was bigger on the scene than de Guzman, and it was almost like Jakarta in 1996-97 and de Guzman with an infinite amount of money were virtually made for each other like a match in heaven.
Jim Richards is an Australian geologist who came to Indonesia in the 90s.
They could not get the money in fast enough. They were chucking money at us as geologists. Spend it, drill more holes. It was just nuts.
De Guzman was often described as an enigma, hard to get to know. If he wasn't partying, he kept to himself. He was born in Manila, in the Philippines, on Valentine's Day in 1956 and got his degree in geology in 1983. He headed to Indonesia in the late 80s, looking to make it big, and he chased gold as hard as he chased women. De Guzman was a perfectionist, hyper-focused on the hunt for the mother lode. the giant gold deposit every geologist dreams of. And that search took him to a place locals call the Land of Hope, where he met the man who would change his life. Kalimantan is the Indonesian portion of the island of Borneo, the largest island in the Indonesian archipelago. It's home to massive mineral deposits. A mineral deposit that is rich enough to be worked for a profit is called an ore body. That's what de Guzman and every other exploration geologist was on the hunt for. But convincing people that an ore body is worth mining takes willpower and persuasion. Someone who had it, and in spades, was a Dutch geologist called John Velderhof.
He had a rugged, strong sort of face with almost built-in skull lines.
Scottish geologist Roger Marjoribanks.
He was quite an intimidating sort of guy, actually, particularly with his heavy Dutch accent, which was there, and his dour, taciturn character, which he had. No, he was quite a scary guy until you got to know him.
Velderhof was often compared to the movie character Indiana Jones. He'd made a name for himself a couple of decades earlier as the man who discovered a giant gold and copper mine in Papua New Guinea. In 1980, he moved to Indonesia, lured by the promise of gold.
There's a guy who wanted to go smoke a cigarette and drink a beer after digging in the rocks all day.
Jennifer Wells worked for Maclean, Canada's national news magazine, and she was on the story for years. Jennifer remembers Velderhof had this reputation for sniffing out gold.
And he had a very interesting background in terms of being a so-called river walker. Multiple sufferer of malaria. Oh, just somebody who believed, who had almost a mystical character. And I think in geologic terms, it would be someone who has such a connection with the land that they have an almost innate ability to understand where, seams of minerals may be present.
In the mid-80s, Velderhof earmarked a site in a small community called Busang, deep in the jungle of Kalimantan, as remote as you can get, 200 kilometers from the nearest town. Velderhof was sure there was gold here, but he needed to persuade more people, and that was proving difficult, even for him. It was in 1987 that Velderhof and de Guzman crossed paths for the first time. The two met while working at the same gold mining site in Kalimantan, the Land of Hope. Pretty quickly, they came to share their love of geology over beers in the bush. De Guzman's geological expertise, his determination to find gold, blew Velderhof away. But they parted ways when de Guzman left the site. But Velderhof didn't forget de Guzman. And a few years later, the two geologists reunited when Velderhof decided he needed someone to help push his theory that Busang was worth drilling for gold. He knew de Guzman would be a valuable asset, a driven geologist, thirsty to make a strike. After agreeing to work with Velderhof, de Guzman trekked over 32 kilometers of remote jungle and started producing piles of reports about the geology around Busang. Like Velderhof, he was convinced there was gold there. Its terrain I remember vividly. When I trekked through the remote jungle in 2007, it was a difficult journey. It took 5 hours over land and another 6 in a canoe. Busang is the last community in a series of river villages. Today, Kalimantan is largely inhabited by the indigenous Dayak people. reporting on this story for the Calgary Herald in 2007, 10 years after Michael de Guzman's death. I traveled up the Mahakam River to meet local Dayaks. I've never forgotten the intense greens of the jungle and the humidity. You go outside and you're instantly covered in sweat. It's so beautiful, but it's also a daunting, difficult place for visitors. I remember what to me were terrifying bugs and leeches that climb inside your trousers and worm their way into your boots. Vines with sharp hooks like barbed wire carpet the jungle. It's not an easy place to work. But de Guzman and Felderhoff believed they could find their fortunes in Lucerne. But luck wasn't on their side.
Good evening. It's Black Monday. There's never been a day like this one on the stock market.
Fear, pandemonium, wreaking havoc in financial markets throughout the world.
Foreign investors pulled out after the global stock market crash of Black Monday on October 19, 1987.
Even in the gold market, they waited for gold to go up as stocks dived. It didn't.
By 1993, both men were down on their luck and they needed a break. The two had expertise, ambition, drive, but it wasn't enough. For their dreams of gold to become a reality, it would take a third man. Just as their fortunes were at a low ebb, Felderhoff got a phone call from a small-time Canadian mining executive he'd met in Australia back in the 80s. You're listening to the $6 billion gold scam from the BBC World Service and CBC. David Walsh was an unlikely savior of faltering dreams. He started a small mining company called Bre-X Minerals in 1989. The Bre was for his son Brett, the X for exploration, Bre-X. Walsh's motto was, quote, "If you believe in something enough, you can sell it." But he was never very good at the selling part, according to former business correspondent for Maclean's magazine, Jennifer Wells.
To me, David didn't stack up at all. He didn't have the salesmanship appeal of the standard promoter or the promoters that I knew, who were always fascinating characters. He didn't have the refinement of a smart chief executive. He didn't have the social ability to engage comfortably, in my experience.
And in 1992, Walsh declared personal bankruptcy. Bre-X limped along barely. By the beginning of 1993, he had to make his own luck. His thoughts turned to the Indiana Jones geologist he'd once met. Maybe he could give him a few leads. Walsh got on the phone to John Felderhoff. The timing was perfect. Felderhoff and de Guzman needed to drum up investment for Lucerne. Felderhoff and Walsh agreed to meet a month later at a bar in Jakarta. Jim Richards.
It's been a long time between drinks for those guys. I think it's been some pretty tough projects, and nobody had they'd never made it, those guys. So this was it was almost like their last chance.
But Walsh wasn't completely sold on Lucerne yet. There were still other sites he was looking at. It worked like this. The Indonesian government would sell the rights to a parcel of land called a property, allowing a company to explore it for a certain period of time. Of course, you wanted to make sure you picked the right property, the one that would yield the most gold for the money you invested in exploration. David Walsh stayed at this hotel in Jakarta, the Seri Pan Pacific, and it's where the meeting took place, where Bre-X and gold fever began. Walsh brought geologist Kevin Waddell along from Calgary to advise him on which mining properties to pick.
There was an urgency to everything. It was businesslike, and they were going to get some sort of deal done. That was pretty apparent.
The dinner was a very formal affair. Kevin Waddell had to change out of his shorts and Hawaiian shirt and into a suit. John Felderhoff, normally a disheveled figure, his glasses held together by tape, was also wearing a suit. Walsh also suited up, donning a tie, something he hated to do. There was a strict etiquette for these two maverick mining personalities to follow, and their futures depended on it. John Felderhoff suspected he could convince Walsh to invest and get the Indonesian government on side, but needed the dinner to go well. Kevin Waddell.
There were some big players, and they were all there to, look at money angles and to get things going. This Adam Tobin, who was apparently had inroads to Suharto, the president.
But their big roller, Adam Tobin, their Indonesian partner, didn't sign on immediately. Walsh didn't either. The next few days were tense, but finally, Walsh was in. He agreed to pay $80,000 US for the rights to explore Busang for a certain period of time, with Felderhoff taking control of operations on the ground. Walsh's role was to convince potential investors there could be gold, so they'd fund the exploration. And Tobin, the prominent Jakarta businessman with links to Suharto, was on board too. He'd be able to smooth the way for their license to explore the area with exclusive rights.
At that time, when the confidence was high, John Felderhoff actually gave me one of Michael de Guzman's cards and gave one to David, and made it very clear that at any project and any work he was doing in Indonesia for David Walsh and Bre-X Minerals, Michael de Guzman would be involved and would be part of the project.
Bre-X was something called a junior mining company. Typically, their role was to explore properties to see if they were worth investing in for bigger companies. To do this, companies like Bre-X had to promote their stock to get the money to fund the exploration. David Walsh needed a credible profile in the press to help draw attention to Busang and encourage investors to buy Bre-X shares. While Jennifer Wells followed Bre-X from Maclean's magazine, she met David Walsh a couple of times.
He decided, on the advice of sort of communications or public relations people who were working for the company, that his best bet would be to find a reporter who would be sympathetic to their story in order to go big on a big business profile in the American press that would sort of set the stage for David Walsh internationally.
And did they find that?
Well, they did. They found it in Fortune magazine, and Richard Behar is the one who wrote the fantastic story.
Yep, it's Richard Behar. Hi, how are you?
How you doing?
Good, I'm just in the middle of putting out a very quick press release. Can I get back to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Richard Behar was one of the only journalists to make it to the exploration site in Busang. He recorded hours of interviews with the key players. When my producers got in touch with Behar, they discovered he still had interviews on cassette tapes stored away in a storage unit in downtown New York.
March 20th. Richard, I hope you got that David Walsh. I hope you got the...
He dug them out and has given us permission to use these Bre-X tapes.
Unanswered questions I have for you now as per item 17.
3 months after the meeting at Saipan Pacific, David Walsh, Michael de Guzman, and John Felderhoff were at work exploring the Busang site. They had a license to explore the land from January 1993 to December 1993, 1 year to make a discovery. In October 1993, they drilled the first hole. Nothing. Then they drilled a second hole. nothing. Things were tense. The men were arguing. Felderhoff was losing faith. It was fast approaching December 18th, the last day they could drill before their license ran out. They only had a matter of days left, but de Guzman wanted to keep going. He said he was certain there was gold. He could smell it, and he knew just where to drill hole 3 and 4. It had come to him in a dream.
You remember going back when de Guzman was up all night? He figured something out.
I wasn't there. I heard the story.
You heard the story. I'm trying to bring that to life a little bit. Now, what's the story you heard?
That's audio of Richard Behar talking to David Walsh in winter 1997, probing his memory. After his dream, de Guzman phoned David Walsh.
I guess Mike woke up, went to bed thinking about it, woke up in the night thinking about it, went to the exploration office in the camp, got the maps out, geological trends or whatever, and woke Caesar up very excited to confirm his hypotheses.
And where was Caesar at the time?
He would have been asleep.
Where?
At the camp.
That's Cesar Puspos, de Guzman's right-hand man and a senior geologist for Bre-X.
Where would Guzman have been?
At the camp.
Oh, they both would have been at the camp.
That's my understanding, yeah.
And he was looking at maps and other geological information, and then suddenly he had a eureka thought. What was it he realized, though?
Well, I guess this maradiatreme something or other, I don't know. He wanted confirmation of his hypothesis, so he woke Caesar up.
And was it also John's hypothesis, or no? Not at that point. I know this is.
I don't know.
Okay.
So they drilled the spot apparently pinpointed by de Guzman in his dream. The results came in. Hole 3, gold was detected. Hole 4 was even better. Nothing on this scale had been found in any of the other samples. And each following drill not only reconfirmed de Guzman's eureka moment, but improved upon it. They discovered the motherlode.
Now this is John's best memory on what he said to you when he woke you up from your sleep.
Yeah.
I hate the harp on this.
No, go ahead.
This is the stuff journalism is.
Okay.
All he could remember saying was, when he picked up the phone, he said, "Look, David, we've got a monster by the tail."
You know, I said something like, "Pardon me, what do you mean?" And he said, "We've got a monster by the tail."
So you can take that saying a few ways. To have a monster by the tail can mean to be in control, guaranteed of success. Or it was a monster underground about to be awoken because John Felderhoff believed they'd only just discovered the tip of its tail. But there's also another meaning, probably not what Felderhoff meant. If you let go of the tail of a monster, you're not in trouble, because it will catch you. But if you hold on, you could also be in trouble. When news hit about the discovery of the gold, Bre-X began to ascend the stock market at lightning speed. Between December 1993 and May 1996, the price went from barely 20 cents to 200 Canadian dollars a share. At its peak, Bre-X was valued at $6 billion. People threw their life savings into it. It was heralded as the biggest ever gold discovery. At its height, Bre-X estimated its Buseng site held almost 80 million ounces of gold. That's 8% of the entire world's gold resources. Roger Marjorie X.
Well, we heard about Bre-X from reports in the press, and particularly the mining press, and we were all as jealous as hell. It was Bre-X had found the one we all hoped to find.
The monster was well and truly loose. There'd been nothing like Bre-X. It was on an unprecedented scale, and it would make many people rich beyond their wildest dreams. Now I'm returning to this story, traveling through Canada, Indonesia, and the Philippines to uncover why Michael de Guzman falling from the helicopter turned those dreams of gold into a waking nightmare. That's next time on the $6 billion gold scam by BBC Scotland Productions for the BBC World Service and CBC. For extended episodes, search for the $6 billion gold scam wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the BBC World Service with the story of Las Patronas.
Hungry migrants risk death by clinging onto La Bestia, a freight train on its way to the US border. As it speeds through a small Mexican town, the women, known as Las Patronas, throw food parcels to them, and they've been doing it for almost 30 years.
Las Patronas, Thursday at 8:30 and 19 GMT. In half an hour, join Claudia Hammond for Health Check. What impact does your ethnicity have on the way you're treated by health services? And could doing a few light exercises while you watch TV in the evening help you sleep better? The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is Alex Ritson with the newsroom. Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu vows revenge after a rocket strike in the occupied Golan Heights leaves at least 12 people, mainly football-playing teenagers, dead.
As
soon as I arrive, I will immediately convene the Security Cabinet. I can say that the State of Israel will not let this pass in silence. We will not overlook this.
Donald Trump courts the cryptocurrency vote.
And we will make America and Bitcoin bigger, better, stronger, richer, freer, and greater than ever before.
France win the men's rugby sevens on day one of the Paris Olympics, while Australia top the medals table. Venezuelans prepare to go to the polls as President Maduro blocks attempts by regional figures to ensure the election is fair. And how much would you pay for Princess Leia's famous golden bikini from Star Wars? Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. At least 12 people have been killed and many others injured in a rocket attack that hit the Druze town of Majdal Shams in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Most of the casualties were teenagers who were playing football. The Israeli Prime Minister blamed Lebanon's Hezbollah movement. It's denied responsibility. Paul Adams is in Jerusalem with this assessment.
This was a disaster for the Druze community in Majdal Shams, but it was also a disaster for Hezbollah. If Hezbollah fired the rocket that caused all of those deaths, then it wasn't just killing Druze citizens in the occupied Golan Heights, it was also affecting the Druze community in its own country. There are Druze people living in Lebanon, and they will be furious at the suggestion, the possibility that Hezbollah, which claims to defend the rights of all Lebanese civilians, has been responsible for killing their kinfolk across the border.
Donald Trump has told a Bitcoin conference he would champion cryptocurrency if he wins the US presidential election in November. He once dismissed digital currencies as a scam, but has recently sought the backing of donors from the industry.
If crypto is going to define the future, I want to be mined, minted, and made in the USA. It's going to be. It's not going to be made anywhere else. And if Bitcoin is going to the moon, as we say, it's going to the moon. I want America to be the nation that leads the way, and that's what's going to happen.
Mr. Trump is now addressing a campaign event in Minnesota where he's ramping up criticism of his Democratic rival Kamala Harris. Earlier, Ms. Harris told a fundraising event in Massachusetts that some of Mr. Trump's criticism of her was weird. Tuareg rebels in northern Mali say they've inflicted heavy losses on government forces and allied Russian mercenaries. They said dozens had been killed in 2 days of clashes close to the Algerian border. Here's Grant Ferret.
Northern Mali, especially its border areas, has been lawless for many years, but the latest fighting appears to have been particularly fierce. A spokesman for an alliance which wants a separate Tuareg homeland accused government troops and mercenaries from Russia's Wagner group of terrorizing civilians in the Tinzouatin area. In response, he said Tuareg fighters had begun to drive out their enemies, who he said had suffered enormous losses. Mali's military said earlier that 2 soldiers had died in the fighting, along with many more rebels.
The largest wildfire in California this year is still out of control, despite the efforts of 2,500 firefighters and several helicopters. The Park Fire, which started near the city of Chico in a suspected arson attack on Wednesday, has been growing by about 20 square kilometres an hour. It now covers more than 1,500 square kilometres. World news from the BBC. The Venezuelan president has defended the decision not to allow several former Latin American leaders into the country to observe Venezuela's presidential election on Sunday. Nicolas Maduro described their attempts to fly into Caracas as ridiculous and said they were far-right politicians who knew they were unacceptable in Venezuela. Leonardo Rocha reports.
Among those on board were the ex-presidents of Mexico and Panama, Vicente Fox and Mireya Moscoso. They said they were supporting the opposition candidate Edmundo González, who's leading the opinion polls. A group of Spanish members of parliament critical of Venezuela's socialist government have also been sent back to Madrid. President Maduro, who is seeking a 3rd term, is sending a strong message to his critics, making it clear that he won't be intimidated by claims of irregularities in Venezuela's electoral process.
Russia says it's taken control of another Ukrainian village in the eastern Donetsk region near the city of Pokrovsk. Its claim to have captured Luzivatska came as the Ukrainians reported heavy fighting in the area, currently the scene of the most intense combat in the east. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi have forcefully reiterated their respective diplomatic positions during a meeting on the sidelines of an ASEAN summit in Laos. Mr. Blinken expressed concern over Beijing's provocative actions around Taiwan and its support for Russia's war on Ukraine. The Chinese foreign minister denied that Beijing was helping the Russian war effort in Ukraine and told Mr. Blinken that Taiwan was not and will not be a country. The World Football Federation, FIFA, has deducted 6 points from the Canadian team at the Olympic Women's Football Tournament following the flying of a drone to spy on New Zealand's training session on Monday. The manager of the Canadian team, Bev Priestman, has been suspended from taking part in any football-related activity for a year. BBC News.
Hello, this is Alex Ritson with the newsroom. It's the deadliest strike in the current round of skirmishes with Hezbollah along Israel's northern border. At least 12 teenagers and young adults were killed on Saturday when a rocket attack hit a football pitch in a remote town in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. Many more were injured. Hezbollah has denied it carried out the strike. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been visiting the United States, said there would be a heavy price to pay.
Since I was updated about the disaster, I have been holding continuous security consultations, and I've directed that our return to Israel be brought forward. As soon as I arrive, I will immediately convene the Security Cabinet. I can say that the State of Israel will not let this pass in silence. We will not overlook this.
Earlier, an Israeli airstrike on a school in central Gaza, where displaced people were sheltering, killed at least 30 Palestinians, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Israel said it was targeting a Hamas command center. Our correspondent Barbara Platt-Usher is in Jerusalem. She told us more about what happened in the Golan Heights.
We know that Hezbollah has categorically denied it's behind the strike on Majd al-Shams, which is in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. But it did claim at least 4 attacks earlier in the evening, before the scale of the Majd al-Shams strike became clear. It was responding to Israeli attacks in Lebanon, which had killed 4 militants. And the Israelis say they are convinced it was Hezbollah. They have released a statement with a graphic saying that they have located from where the strike was launched and that it is just north of Majd al-Shams in Lebanon and right in the direct line of fire to this village, but Hezbollah had earlier also said that it was targeting an Israeli base, and that particular base is in between the village and the launch site. Hezbollah continues to very strongly deny it.
And this is only going to add to long-standing fears of regional escalation.
Yes, there has been conflict on the northern border of Israel since October, when Hamas carried out those attacks in southern Israel, and then Israel started the war in Gaza. And Hezbollah had joined early on, saying that it was acting in solidarity with Hamas. But these attacks back and forth have been contained, essentially. They've been pretty regular. There have been increases and escalations from time to time, but they have managed to avoid a wider war. There has been a great deal of concern, especially from Israel's allies, that there would be a miscalculation that would trigger an all-out war, and there is concern that this might be it. You've had some very strong statements from the Israelis saying that they would respond. You've also had a rare statement from the Lebanese government, which usually stays out of this, condemning the attack on civilians, saying this violates international law, and urging a de-escalation in the situation. So there is a great deal of concern that things will get worse and that they might build into a wider conflict.
Barbara, what's the significance of this area, the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights?
So the citizens in the Golan Heights, many of them actually have Syrian nationality, because the Israelis captured the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967. Then they annexed it in 1981, and they offered citizenship to the Arab Druze, this Arab Druze minority. And they rejected the citizenship, but they have lived peacefully. It would be a group that Hezbollah would not want to be targeting, because there are Arab Druze not only in Syria, but also in Lebanon. Interestingly, you did have a statement from the head of the Druze in Lebanon, Walid Jumblat. He also called the targeting of civilians unacceptable and condemned it, but he again said it was crucial to prevent the expansion of the war. He said that in light of Hezbollah's statement, he focused then on what he called Israel's long-standing efforts to incite discord and fragment the region. So it sounded like he was also, despite the fact that it was his community that was hit, was trying to de-escalate the situation.
Barbara Platash in Jerusalem. As the race for the White House gathers pace, Donald Trump is holding his latest rally in Minnesota. He attacked his rivals, President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who's set to take over as the Democratic presidential nominee.
6 days ago, we officially defeated the worst president in the history of the United States, crooked Joe Biden. Have you heard of him? We have a new victim now, Kamala. We have a brand new victim. Less than 4 months from now, Minnesota is going to defeat Kamala Harris.
The campaign event is inside a hockey arena in St. Cloud, but Donald Trump has promised to continue holding outdoor rallies, contrary to safety recommendations from the US Secret Service following his assassination attempt. In a post on his own social media platform, Mr. Trump said that the Secret Service had agreed to provide increased protection and no one can be allowed to stop free speech. So just how important are outdoor rallies for Mr. Trump's presidential campaign? My colleague Jackie Leonard put that question to our correspondent David Willis.
They're very important to Donald Trump. Indoor rallies are, of course, easier to police than outdoor ones, because everyone in attendance has to pass through a magnetometer, and outdoor rallies afford wider access, as we saw in Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago when that lone gunman managed to open fire from a nearby roof. Mr. Trump favors outdoor rallies because you can get more people in, and he says the atmosphere can be more electric.
Well, he's been at another event today, a Bitcoin conference, and he's been talking about his plans to grow Bitcoin in the US.
With your help, we will save our nation, we will restore our republic, and we will make America and Bitcoin bigger, better, stronger, richer, freer, and greater than ever before.
And this is quite
quite a change of stance on cryptocurrencies for him, isn't it?
It is. He hasn't always been a fan of cryptocurrency. During his time in the White House, he dismissed them as highly volatile and based on thin air. And his conversion has come at a time when major crypto companies are making big donations to the 2024 presidential election campaign in a bid to stave off the sort of tough regulation that was introduced by Joe Biden. Now, Mr. Trump has vowed to ease regulatory oversight of the industry, and in the speech today, he said that it was his aim to make the US the crypto capital of the planet, as he put it.
Now, meantime, what are we to make of remarks that Mr. Trump made at another event, this time in Florida on Friday, that his supporters wouldn't have to vote again if he wins November's election?
Yes, those remarks have caused some consternation, and up until a short while ago, the Trump campaign hadn't responded directly to a request for clarification. Addressing a Christian convention in Palm Beach, Florida, Mr. Trump told supporters, "Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years and it will be fixed." Now, Donald Trump does occasionally make these sort of remarks, only to later claim that he was joking or that the remarks were taken out of context. But he told Fox News back in December that if elected in November, he would be a dictator for a day. And he sought, of course, to overturn the result of the 2020 presidential election, prompting Joe Biden and others to brand him a threat to democracy. So many will wonder what he actually means.
And meanwhile, what's going on with the Harris campaign?
Well, Kamala Harris has been addressing a gathering in Massachusetts featuring the musicians James Taylor and Yo-Yo Ma, and in a few hours' time she'll be taking part